Greetings, friends. I am Vitaly Portnikov. Poland should participate in nuclear distribution and have its own nuclear civilian military capacities, Polish President Karol Nawrocki said. This statement by the Polish president was made shortly after the unprecedented attack of Russian drones on Poland. And although this time dozens of drones were reconnaissance drones that did not carry an immediate military threat, many in Warsaw continue to fear that the attack will happen again. And next time it will be attack drones. Therefore, it is clear that the Polish leadership is looking for ways to protect the country from Russian pressure. Earlier, Prime Minister Donald Tusk also said that Poland would be safer if it had its own nuclear potential. So we can state the unity of opinions in the Polish leadership. Interestingly, Karol Nawrocki's statement was made in response to a question about Warsaw's attitude to the initiative of French President Emmanuel Macron, who had previously talked about the possibility of deploying elements of the French nuclear complex in the Allied countries. Thus, the words of the Polish president can be considered a response not only to Moscow but also to Washington, in response to concerns that if the pressure of the Russian Federation from Central Europe increases, the President of the United States Donald Trump will not defend Poland and other states that are on the state border with the Russian Federation, and which, of course, in this sense are the most vulnerable in the event of an escalation in the Russian-Ukrainian war. The fact that Donald Trump practically did not notice the Russian attack on Poland and preferred to say that it was most likely a mistake. The fact that the United States has not given a clear political assessment of this attack by the Russian Federation for quite a long time, and claims that it must complete the investigation of its circumstances, of course, cannot but cause concern in Warsaw, in the capitals of the Baltic countries, and in general in the NATO member countries, where everything is increasingly many are wondering to what extent the United States is actually, and not in words, ready to adhere to the very fifth article, which until recently seemed to be the main cornerstone of security on the entire European continent. And so the question arises, if the United States perceives its own collision with the Russian Federation as the most serious element of risk, then to what extent can the countries of Central Europe feel safe? If Donald Trump's main task is to avoid this collision and not to protect them from Russian aggression, which, as we see, can manifest itself completely unexpected forms. And if we are not talking about a direct invasion, not about tank armies and artillery, but, for example, about a missile attack or a drone attack, then what will the United States do to force Moscow to abandon its aggressive intentions? Using the example of the American president's attitude to the Russian-Ukrainian war, and his constant attempts to shift responsibility from the aggressor to the victim, this is really an urgent security issue. And there is no time for good relations with Trump and no time for political beliefs. It's a matter of survival. And in this situation, of course, the proposal of President Emmanuel Macron looks quite attractive. But again, a fairly simple question arises. How realistic is this proposal, and how much time does it take to implement it? Consultations between Paris and Berlin on nuclear cooperation are just beginning. It is worth remembering that earlier in Germany this idea was always rejected, and only the new government of Friedrich Merz declared its readiness to start consultations with the French leadership. But it is clear that these consultations are not for one day, or even for 1 year. And it is quite possible that these consultations will be completed by the successor of Emmanuel Macron as President of France. The question immediately arises who will be this successor and whether this new president from the far-right camp will adhere to the Trumpian attitude to security and believe that France should protect itself first of all, and not its neighbors on the continent. And thus, Emmanuel Macron's initiative will remain only an example of common sense in conditions when politics is gradually losing this common sense. And it is clear that the issue of the so-called nuclear distribution can appear on the NATO agenda only after France and Germany come to some kind of understanding. Britain should not be expected to play any special initiative role here, if only because London's nuclear potential is linked to the United States, and in order to freely dispose of it in European interests, the British government will have to expect, but at least a change of power in the United States itself. And if power changes in the United States, it is quite possible that the new president will abandon Donald Trump's political course in favor of European and world security and declare rejection of isolationism as a course that obviously contradicts the interests of the United States itself. But the fact that Poland is beginning to think about its own participation in obtaining nuclear weapons from allies shows the level of concern that exists in Central European countries in connection with the ongoing Russian-Ukrainian war, and the lack of understanding by Western leaders of how they can stop this war in the foreseeable future and resist Russia's ambitions, which are actively supported from Beijing. And there is an understanding that if Putin's desire to continue the war against Ukraine for an indefinite time is not stopped by Western efforts, and there is little hope for Donald Trump here, then this war will take on new forms, and eventually cross the borders of Ukraine, as we saw during the last one, the attacks of the Russian Federation on Poland, and the constant appearance of Russian unmanned aerial vehicles in the airspace of NATO member countries. I have no doubt that this appearance will only increase with each month and with each year of the Russian-Ukrainian confrontation. And therefore, the appearance of elements of nuclear weapons in countries that may be the next target of Russian destabilizing pressure, even hybrid, is indeed a completely logical answer to the question that arises. But the important question is whether this answer can be implemented in practice, or it will only remain in the declarations of politicians counting on common sense to prevail. Thank you, friends. Stay on this channel, subscribe to it, subscribe to my social networks, to the channel in Patreon Bameko Feed Nutella, which helps to develop these resources of users of the sponsorship function in YouTube itself. Global.